The afternoon sun filtered through the crystal chandeliers of the Riverside Country Club's main dining room, casting delicate patterns across the pristine white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. From my seat near the windows, I had a perfect view of the manicured golf course stretching toward the river, its emerald fairways dotted with carefully placed sand traps and water hazards. I'd chosen this table deliberately, not just for the view, but because it offered the best vantage point to observe the family reunion lunch across the room. My extended family had gathered to celebrate my grandmother's 80th birthday. As usual, I was watching from a distance rather than participating directly. The Williams family had always been complicated. Old money, old traditions, and very old prejudices about who truly belonged. My grandmother Eleanor had married my grandfather in 1962, uniting two established families with deep roots in the community. Their children and grandchildren grew up expecting certain privileges, social positions, and standards of behavior. I had never quite fit their definition of appropriate. "Sophia, darling, you look lovely," my Aunt Patricia called out as I approached their long table. Her tone carried the forced politeness of someone being gracious but not entirely welcoming. Patricia, my father's sister, had married well and spent the last 30 years perfecting the art of social positioning. My cousin Bradley, Patricia's son, glanced up from his conversation with obvious reluctance. "Oh. Hi, Sophia. I didn't expect to see you here." "It's grandmother's birthday," I replied simply, settling into the lone empty chair at the far end of the table. "Of course I'd be here." "Of course," echoed my cousin Miranda, Bradley's sister, though her tone suggested my presence was more surprising than inevitable. "How are things going with your ventures?" The way she said ventures made it sound like she was referring to an embarrassing hobby rather than my career. "Things are going well," I said, accepting a menu from the server without elaborating further. My family had never quite understood what I did for a living. They knew I worked in technology. They knew I traveled often. They knew I lived modestly in a small apartment rather than the grand home they believed someone of our name should occupy. What they didn't know was the full scope of what I had built over the last 8 years. "Sophia's still doing that computer consulting thing," my Uncle Charles explained to his wife as though I weren't sitting right there. Charles, my father's brother, was a successful lawyer who had inherited much of the family's real estate investments. "How interesting," his wife Margaret replied with polite disinterest that suggested she found it anything but. My grandmother, the guest of honor, smiled warmly from her seat at the head of the table. "Sophia dear, tell us about your recent travels. Patricia mentioned you were in Asia again." "I was in Singapore and Tokyo for a few weeks," I confirmed, "working with some international clients." "Still doing that freelance work?" Bradley asked, his voice lined with condescension. At 32, Bradley worked for his father-in-law's investment firm and never missed an opportunity to remind us that he was building something substantial. "Something like that," I said quietly. The conversation drifted to other topics. Miranda's upcoming charity gala, Charles's latest golf tournament, Patricia's new interior designer. I listened absently, my attention wandering to the familiar details of the club. The Riverside Country Club had been the social center of the community for over a century. Founded in 1895, it sprawled across 200 acres of prime riverfront real estate. It boasted an 18-hole championship golf course, tennis courts, pools, and dining facilities that rivaled the best restaurants in the city. Membership was exclusive, expensive, and passed down through families like a sacred heirloom. My family had been members since the 1940s, when my great-grandfather first achieved the social status required for admission. The club represented everything they valued: tradition, exclusivity, and connections that opened doors. It was also, as of 18 months ago, mine. "The salmon is excellent today," my grandmother said, interrupting my thoughts. "Sophia, you should try it." "I'll probably just have the salad," I replied, not for cost reasons as my family no doubt assumed. "Still watching the budget?" Miranda asked with feigned sympathy. "It must be difficult managing finances without a steady income." I smiled at her. "I manage." "Have you thought about finding something more stable?" Bradley pressed. "The freelance lifestyle might be fun when you're young, but eventually you need something permanent. Something with benefits." "Yes," Patricia added helpfully. "Health insurance, retirement planning, the things that really matter as you get older." I was only 30, hardly ancient. But my family had a way of making me feel like a reckless teenager every time we gathered. I have benefits, I said simply. Through some kind of freelancer association? Charles asked, genuinely curious but skeptical. Something like that. The truth was far more complicated than they could imagine. At 15 I had started coding as a hobby. By 18 I was building websites for local businesses. At 22 I developed a mobile app that was acquired by a major tech company for $12 million. That windfall became the seed money for Williams Digital Solutions, a consulting firm that helped traditional businesses integrate advanced technology. Over the past 8 years, WDS had grown from a one-woman operation in my apartment to a global company with 47 employees and offices in 6 countries. But to my family, I was still just dabbling in computer consulting. Well, my grandmother said diplomatically, I'm proud of all my grandchildren for following their own paths. Of course, grandmother, Miranda chimed in quickly. We all support Sophia's choices. The word hung in the air, dismissive and sharp. Speaking of choices, Bradley said, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smile, I have exciting news to share. All attention turned toward him. Jennifer and I just put in an offer on the Morrison estate, he announced proudly. If everything goes through, we'll be moving into one of the most prestigious properties in the city. The table erupted in congratulations and excited questions. The Morrison estate was one of the most sought-after properties in the region. A sprawling mansion on 20 acres, with sweeping views of both the river and the city skyline. How wonderful! Patricia exclaimed. Bradley, that's such an achievement. Your father and I are so proud. The asking price was substantial, Bradley continued, puffing with pride. But with my position at the firm and Jennifer's family connections, we were able to secure very favorable financing. And of course, Miranda added smoothly, it's the kind of property that makes a statement about your place in the community. I listened to their excited chatter, remembering the phone call I'd received from my investment advisor just 2 weeks earlier. Sophia, he'd said, the Morrison estate is finally coming on the market. I know you expressed interest last year. Are you still considering making an offer? I'd been considering it for more than a year. The estate was beautiful, yes, but more importantly, it fit perfectly into my long-term business strategy. The property included not only the main house but several outbuildings that could be converted into office space for WDS's North American headquarters. Yes, I told him. Put in an offer. Full asking price. No contingencies. Sophia, that's a $40 million property. I'm aware, I'd replied. Can we close within 2 weeks? Apparently, my offer had been accepted before Bradley's financing had even been approved. Back at the table, my grandmother turned her warm gaze on me. Sophia, you're being very quiet. What do you think of Bradley's wonderful news? I think the Morrison estate is a beautiful property, I said honestly. Whoever ends up buying it will be very fortunate. Well, that'll be us, Bradley said with smug satisfaction. Jennifer's father knows the seller personally, so we're confident our offer will be accepted. I nodded, saying nothing about the fact that the estate had already been sold. The conversation carried on through the main course, with Bradley holding court about his future renovations. Miranda boasted about her charity work, volunteer positions that gave her social access without requiring her to earn an income. Charles recounted his golf triumphs. Patricia detailed her upcoming Mediterranean cruise. Nobody asked about my work, my travels, or my plans. I was used to it. The family member who listened rather than spoke, who observed rather than belonged. I'll be right back, I said, excusing myself. I want to freshen up before dessert. The ladies' lounge was elegant, with marble countertops and crystal mirrors reflecting the club's old-world atmosphere. I was washing my hands when the door opened. Can you believe she actually came? Miranda's voice rang out. I glanced up in the mirror to see her and Patricia entering, unaware of my presence. I thought she might skip this one, Patricia replied. These family gatherings must be so uncomfortable for her. Well, she can't afford to go anywhere else for a nice meal, Miranda said with a laugh. This is probably the only time she gets to eat somewhere decent. It's sad really, Patricia added. She's 30 years old with no real career, no husband, no prospects. Living in that tiny apartment, pretending that computer hobby of hers is a business. At least she's trying, Miranda said, her tone making it clear this was faint praise. Even if she's not very successful at it. I cleared my throat softly. Both women froze, their faces coloring as they realized I'd been there all along. Sophia, Patricia said quickly. We were just having a private conversation. I understand, I replied calmly, drying my hands with deliberate care. I walked past them toward the door, but Miranda's voice stopped me. Sophia, you know we support you, right? We're family. We want you to succeed. I turned, meeting their uneasy expressions, half guilt, half condescension. I know exactly what you want, I said quietly and left the lounge. When I returned, dessert was being served. My grandmother's favorite chocolate cake, crafted by the club's renowned pastry chef. The conversation had shifted to Miranda's upcoming charity auction, though I could feel tension simmering across the table. Sophia, my grandmother said warmly, I ordered you a slice of the chocolate cake. I know it's your favorite too. Thank you, grandmother, I said, touched by her thoughtfulness. So tell me, Eleanor continued, when will you be traveling again? I worry about you being away so much. I'll probably be in London next month, I replied. Then Berlin in the spring. More consulting work? Charles asked, his tone heavy with confusion. He'd never understood what kind of consulting demanded so much international travel. Yes. We're expanding our European operations. We. Bradley caught the pronoun instantly. My company, I clarified. Williams Digital Solutions. I thought you were freelancing, Miranda said, still uneasy from our encounter in the lounge. I was, initially. But the business has grown over the years. How grown? Bradley asked. For the first time all day, his voice carried genuine curiosity. Before I could answer, Robert Chin, the club's general manager, appeared at our table. A polished professional, Robert had run the Riverside Country Club for 5 years, transforming it into one of the most prestigious and profitable private clubs in the region. Good afternoon, everyone, he said with his usual smile. I hope you're enjoying Mrs. Williams's birthday celebration. Everything has been lovely, Robert, my grandmother replied. Please give our compliments to the chef. Of course. And Ms. Williams, his eyes turned to me. The quarterly reports you requested are ready for your review. Should I have them sent to your usual table? The table went silent. Every eye turned toward me, confusion and suspicion thick in the air. That would be fine, Robert, I said calmly. Thank you. Also, the renovations to the East Wing are on schedule. The new private dining rooms should be ready by spring. Excellent. I'll want to see the progress tomorrow. I'll arrange a walkthrough for 10 a.m. if that works. After Robert departed, the silence stretched until Bradley finally spoke. Sophia, what quarterly reports is he talking about? I took a slow sip of coffee, weighing my words. The truth would come out soon enough, especially when Bradley's deal collapsed and the truth of the sale emerged. The club's quarterly financial reports, I said simply. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Why would you need to review the club's financial reports? Because, I said, meeting her gaze, I own the club. The silence that followed was so profound I could hear conversations from other tables, the distant buzz of golf carts outside, even the pounding of my own heartbeat. You what? Miranda whispered. I own the Riverside Country Club, I repeated, calm as ever. I purchased it 18 months ago when the previous ownership group decided to sell. Bradley's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You bought the country club? The real estate, the facilities, the golf course, the business operations. I did, I confirmed. It's been one of Williams Digital Solutions' most successful investments. Charles stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. Williams Digital Solutions owns the Riverside Country Club? He asked. Among other properties, I said evenly. We've been diversifying into hospitality and real estate as part of our long-term growth strategy. How much did it cost? Patricia whispered. $68 million, I replied. Though we've invested another $12 million in renovations and improvements since then. My grandmother was the first to recover. She began to laugh, a warm, delighted sound that broke the silence. Sophia dear, she said, her eyes twinkling. I think you've been keeping secrets from your family. Just a few, I admitted. A few. Bradley sputtered. You own an $80 million country club and you call that a few secrets? The club is just one asset, I said calmly. Williams Digital Solutions has a diversified portfolio. How diversified? Charles asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted the answer. I pulled out my phone and opened the summary report my CFO had sent me that morning. Currently, WDS has assets of approximately $2.4 billion, I read. We employ 847 people across 6 countries, and our annual revenue last year was $340 million. The silence that followed was deeper, more stunned than before. You're a billionaire, Miranda whispered. On paper, I confirmed. Most of the value is tied up in business assets and real estate investments, like the Morrison estate. Bradley's eyes widened as realization struck. The Morrison estate? Among others, I said. We closed on that property last week. It will be converted into our North American headquarters and research facility. Bradley's face cycled through shades of red before settling into an unhealthy gray. You bought the Morrison estate out from under me. I made a better offer, I said gently. Full asking price. No contingencies. In business that usually wins. But you let me talk about it all through lunch, he said, his voice rising. You let me boast in front of everyone, knowing you already owned it. You never asked if I knew anything about it, I pointed out. And I didn't want to spoil grandmother's birthday celebration with family drama. Patricia shook her head in disbelief. All this time we thought you were struggling. We thought you needed help. I know what you thought, I said, recalling the conversation I'd overheard in the ladies' lounge. Miranda flushed scarlet. Sophia, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. That I was successful? I interrupted. No, you didn't. Because you never asked. You assumed, because I drive a modest car and live in a small apartment. Why do you live in a small apartment if you can afford anything you want? Charles asked, genuinely puzzled. Because I don't need a mansion, I said simply. I travel more than half the year for business. When I'm home, I want a comfortable space that's easy to maintain, not a showcase property. And the car? Patricia asked. It's efficient and reliable. I don't need to impress anyone with my transportation choices. My grandmother smiled, clearly enjoying the revelations. Sophia, did you ever imagine you'd end up owning the place where our family has celebrated for decades? Actually, I said, that was part of the appeal. This club has always been important to our family. When I learned it was for sale, I wanted to ensure it remained available for occasions like this. So, you bought it for sentimental reasons? Miranda asked. Partly. But mostly because it was a sound investment. The club was undervalued and underutilized. We've increased membership, improved the facilities, expanded the services. It's now one of the most profitable private clubs in the region. Just then Robert appeared again with a leather portfolio. Ms. Williams, here are those quarterly reports. Also, we've received 3 more applications for corporate memberships this week. Excellent. We'll review them at next week's board meeting, I said. When he left, Bradley looked at me with something between shock and respect. Sophia, I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like you were, he faltered. Unsuccessful. I suggested. Yes, he admitted. I was wrong. Very wrong. We all were, Patricia added softly. Sophia, I'm sorry for the assumptions I made. And I'm sorry for what I said in the lounge, Miranda said, her voice thick with shame. It was cruel and unfair. I looked around at my family, faces now marked with embarrassment, curiosity, and the first flickers of genuine respect. I don't need apologies, I said at last. But I would like us to try knowing each other better. Real conversations about what we're actually doing with our lives, not just assumptions based on appearances. I'd like that, my grandmother said warmly. Sophia, would you tell us about your company? I'd love to understand what you've built. For the next hour, I did something I hadn't done in years. I truly participated in a family conversation. I told them about Williams Digital Solutions, our clients, the challenges of building a global firm. They asked thoughtful questions, for once listening instead of dismissing. 3 months later, I hosted my first family gathering as the official owner of the Riverside Country Club. My grandmother's birthday had been such a success that we decided to make it a quarterly tradition. But this time the dynamic was entirely different. Instead of sitting at the far end of the table as an afterthought, I was at the center of discussions about business investments and future plans. My family now sought my advice and spoke of Williams Digital Solutions with respect, treating it as the major corporation it had become. "Sophia," my grandmother said as dessert was served, "thank you for saving our club. When the previous owners announced they were selling, I was so afraid we'd lose this place. But you've not only preserved it, you've made it better." Patricia smiled self-consciously. "Especially for those of us who underestimated the new owner." "Especially those," I agreed with a grin. Looking around the table at my family, people who finally knew me for who I truly was, I felt grateful for the long road that had brought me here. Being underestimated had taught me to value authentic success over appearances. Building something meaningful while being dismissed had made me stronger. And I'd learned the most important lesson of all. The best way to change people's perceptions isn't by boasting about your achievements. It's by quietly building something so substantial it speaks for itself. The Riverside Country Club thrived under my ownership. Profitable, prestigious, and symbolic of what belief in one's own vision could achieve. And every time I sat at my usual table, gazing out at the golf course that had become one of my proudest investments, I remembered the whispered comment that had started it all. "She can't afford to be here." Now, of course, no one could be there without my permission. But more importantly, I had created a place where my family could gather, not just to celebrate birthdays and milestones, but to finally understand that success comes in many forms. And sometimes, the quietest person at the table has the most interesting story to tell.